Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for once again taking time out of your day to join us here at the Cybersecurity Insider program. My name is John Gomez. If I haven't met you in the past, I'm the Chief Security and Engineering Officer for CloudWave. Um, Today's presentation's going to focus on lessons from the energy sector. And so I'll talk a little bit about how this came to be and also a little bit about why we think that it's an appropriate topic to share with all of you. As always, please feel free to ask questions. Raise your hand, put them in the chat window if you wish. If you wish to be unmuted, just let us know, and my colleague Laura will make sure to take the appropriate action. But with that, let's talk a little bit about CloudWave Sensato is a healthcare specific cybersecurity and cloud hosting firm. So, why are we here talking about the energy sector and, how do we know anything about it? So let me just kind of talk a little bit about how we got to this knowledge base. Sensato, when we started, we were the first healthcare specific cybersecurity firm. As you may know now, we were acquired by CloudWave back in November of last year. And we are also what's known as an ISAO, an Information Sharing and Analysis Organization. So although we focus on healthcare, pretty much, that's what we do day in and day out, our status as an ISAO, an Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, and I'm assuming people know what that is. If you don't, it's a designation under the Department of Homeland Security that you'll work with them and share information related to critical infrastructure security. When we became an ISAO, we were asked to be a cross-sector ISAO. So although in our day-to-day work, we specifically focus on healthcare cybersecurity, when it comes to being an ISAO, we're actually a cross-sector ISAO, meaning we actually receive intelligence and work on projects across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So hopefully I'm not confusing you too much, but basically short of it is day to day, our focus is healthcare, but as an ISAO, we operate across the 16 different critical infrastructure sectors. And the reason we do that is because we feel that what's going on in the other sectors is important for healthcare, right? If we can see that there's threat intelligence or TTPs or something occurring, say in the aviation industry or in energy or oil and gas or something, that is important to us to understand if that is an impact or an early indicator of something that could happen within the healthcare sector. So from time to time, we get asked to perform work or services in some of these other sectors. And so energy is one where we have been approached a few times and asked, hey, can you provide services to this organization or that organization? So typically it's going to be pretty large scale energy providers, and typically they will have nuclear power plants and they'll be providing electric and power services to a state or a region of the country, and we're asked to get involved and evaluate them and assess their risk. We also do the similar thing with city government from time to time. So we've worked with police departments, city government, and some other non-healthcare agencies. And I think this is, again, important for us to be able to look at those things and keep ourselves fresh and understand what's happening in those other sectors, and then bring that back to healthcare. And ultimately, hopefully that helps us all get better. So that's kind of how this led to us thinking about, hey, what have we learned in the energy sector when we do support that environment, and what can be translated to healthcare. So before I get into the specifics of that, I will say healthcare and energy are very similar in some ways. And in some ways, there are some differences, but overall, I'd say, if we were to do a Venn diagram, the Venn diagram would show a lot more overlap between these two sectors than most people may realize. Energy is a very high threat sector, so is healthcare, right? Healthcare actually is the #1 attacked sector out of the 16. Energy follows very closely behind. The energy sector also operates on very, very slim margins. I can tell you that, most hospitals, I think, operate on a margin of like 1 to 3, 3 to 5% margin. Energy sectors typically about a 1 to 3% margin is what they operate on. And the reason I bring that up is because the economics are very similar, right? Everybody's scrapping for that dollar. It's not a cash cow kind of industry. The other thing is, obviously they come under private-public regulations and guidelines, and similar with healthcare, right? You're not only dealing with, things like HIPAA, but you're also expected to meet state regulations, CMS, JCO, and other things that impact how you do things. I will say in this regard, the energy sector has a much more advanced and complicated set of regulations which work for them and against them. Often I think that having similar regulations in the healthcare industry would be beneficial to securing the healthcare sector. Energy does have, because of the nuclear component, a lot more scrutiny and oversight and regulatory standards that they have to meet. So for example, things like NIST 853 are not really optional for them, right? They have to do that. And interestingly enough, they also in many cases have to meet HIPAA and PCI and all those other things that obviously healthcare is kind of very familiar with. So there's a lot of similarities. Both our tech sectors have a lot of challenges in regards to recruiting and staff retention and getting the right resources. But with that, again, there are some differences, and we'll touch on those. I think that in many ways, unfortunately, I think the energy sector is somewhat further along in terms of their overall maturity when it comes to security. And again, I suspect that is probably because of the regulatory environment that they're in. So they don't really have to convince anybody that this is a good security practice or we should be investing in these security tools or services, because it's not really an alternative. There's no like, oh, we don't really have to do that, right? They have to, by regulatory requirement, do certain things. Again, also that doesn't always work the best because you are getting a lot of regulatory scrutiny. But with that, kind of today we're going to just dive into the whole energy sector and kind of what we took away from it. I tried to keep this short and not really go real deep, but always happy to get together with people offline or to answer questions here if you feel there's areas you'd like to go deeper into. So we kind of really work through this introduction as part of the first couple slides, so I'm not going to belabor that. But at a high level, at a glance, if you will, there are basically 5 areas, and I'll try to touch on these a little bit more through the remaining deck as to, what are the key differentiators I've seen between the energy sector and the healthcare sector. And some of it, it comes down to, their approach to risk management is one big difference. We'll talk about that. The technologies they employ, I think, are still very new to the healthcare sector, and so we'll talk about that. Like, what are they doing? The way they go about their culture and training, for security, I think is vastly different than I've seen in most hospitals. Although I think some of the university hospitals reflect maybe a little bit what the energy sector does. And then how they govern their security programs and ultimately how they integrate security across an environment are vastly different than I've seen. Now, the one thing I will say, I think what's interesting is, we can find islands of hospitals within the healthcare sector, and I'm talking very broadly, right, across all 8,000 hospitals in the U.S. and Canada and Europe, and even in Singapore and Australia, where I've had experience working with hospitals there. As an industry, as a sector worldwide, we can find islands of organizations that really kind of, you could look at the energy sector and say, wow, you could learn a lot from them. I think the challenge is that we're talking about islands of hospitals. When you look at the energy sector, one big differentiator is that security is pretty standard across the entire sector. And so, that's a pretty big differentiator. So we'll talk more about that and kind of get into each one of these. Again, if you have questions, feel free to ask. So let's start with their approach to risk. I think the way we do risk assessments here in healthcare is what I would consider more reactive, right? Most organizations, most hospitals, they do yearly risk assessment, and frankly, we have hospitals who've come to us and said, we forgot to do our assessment last year. Can you do an assessment for us really quickly? So it's not something where risk assessments, and regardless of the way that you're doing them, are typically, hey, HIPAA says you should be doing it, so we do a yearly assessment. In the energy sector, we see more what I would categorize as a dynamic risk assessment. And risk assessments are really used as an ongoing tool to monitor the state of the organization. They really do a great job of not just, hey, we got to do this assessment, there's a bunch of findings, we're going to put together some kind of mitigation plan, and hopefully we'll address things. They are continually doing risk assessments. And so that dynamic nature, I think, is something we can learn from them. And I'll talk more about some tools you can use for that, but they're typically, and we'll talk more about threat intelligence, but they're usually mapping that risk assessment to their intelligence in the current threat landscape. So their risk assessments are typically more fluid, more dynamic, and ongoing. It drives a lot of what they do, right? So they will think about things like resource prioritization based on those risk assessments. And again, since it's tied to the current threat landscape, it really gives them a posture of being very proactive in terms of how they're going to allocate resources and where they're going to do patch management and change management, and how their incident response plans need to be updated, or where they need to be in terms of dealing with an active threat. And so, that's kind of an interesting thing. The other thing is, their integration with SCADA systems, right? So they are using a lot of SCADA applications, right, which are basically these large control systems that control, the production of energy, or used to manage and control and monitor nuclear power plants or energy distribution. And really the place that we in healthcare kind of can equate that, or we can see that, we have a similar kind of situation, is medical devices, right? So, in the energy sector, they think of things in terms of IT and OT. And I think we, at least when we're working with organizations, have been trying to get that division, that thinking pushed into the way we do assessments, right? So you have your IT infrastructure, and then you have your OT, your operating technology infrastructure. And that's kind of how the energy sector divides it. And the rules and the way they manage their OT, which is their SCADA systems, their most important systems, is much different than the way they manage their IT. It doesn't mean that IT is not managed appropriately or is insecure, but if they have a dollar and they can only invest that dollar, that's all they have to invest, and that dollar is going to go to security, then they will invest that dollar in OT, right? And they will make sure that OT environment is extremely secure. I think the same thing, could be done and adopted here in healthcare, where we're looking at dynamic risk assessments, using risk assessments as an ongoing tool that we measure and work against, and then kind of think of our environments as IT and OT, where OT is our medical devices, our systems that absolutely can never go down or be impacted by a security event. So just something to think about. The other thing with their dynamic risk assessments and using it as a tool is, these are things that the board is aware of, their risk assessments. And they really need to understand at a board level and a C-suite level, what is their current security posture related to their risks. So it's not just something like, hey, you bring in a bunch of consultants, you do a security risk assessment, and then that report really typically stays with IT, and maybe the board gives you 15, 20, 30 minutes to explain what the assessment findings were. The board and the C-suite are very actively involved in monitoring risk. So that's kind of a big differentiator, I think. The side that supports that is threat intelligence monitoring. And they've really done a great job at really assuring that they have industry-specific threat feeds, right? So they understand, what devices within their environment are potentially coming under attack, what those attacks look like, what the TTPs are associated with them. They're evaluating those threats. The second piece here that I really want to hold on is the collaborative nature of what I saw when I've worked with energy sectors. And this is something they actually work very hard of and is considered a requirement for them, is how they share information between energy sector organizations, right? So you can have an organization providing power to citizens in Utah, and they will share information with every other power provider across this country. And so, the reason for that is to make sure that if one of them sees something, they all become aware of it, and then they all understand how to deal with that. And in healthcare, that's been tried several times. In fact, the New Jersey Hospital Association reached out to me several weeks ago and asked, is there a way CloudWave could create some type of information sharing portal where hospitals could share information? And it's something I've thought about. The hard part is the lawyers. There's still a lot of challenges with the legal side of sharing information in the healthcare sector. And this really does hurt us, right? Because we can see a hospital we've had multiple times now where a hospital's been hit by ransomware in one part of the country, and then suddenly you start seeing the reports go across the country, and other hospitals are hit. And in the energy sector, they really work to minimize that. If there's an attack, a very targeted attack against one power plant, they will immediately disclose that attack to every other power plant and advise them of the TTP, the indicators of compromise, how they mitigated the attack, what they did, and what the fallout is. And in healthcare, it's so, opposite of that. And I think that is a big, big challenge for us to get across. And I know it's not something that is probably the purview of those of you on this call, but it is something eventually to be successful. We've got to find a way to share information. So the collaboration capability in the energy sector, far, far further ahead than I've ever seen in the healthcare sector. And if you think CloudWave supporting some kind of collaborative network is of interest and we should do it, then please let us know, because it is an investment. I'm not sure we can do it, and even if we did, again, the big issue is how many of your hospitals would give you clearance that if you had an event to immediately be able to talk, share that information. And not even the hospital. We have now cyber liability insurance policies that don't allow you to disclose. So again, for us as CloudWave to invest in that, we'd have to be assured that, hey, those roadblocks aren't going to be there, because that's a lot to put in place, and then find out you can't do it because of cyber liability or your general counsel. Automated response, a big thing in the energy sector, and we've been trying to push that in the CloudWave world. We have a new product out called Nightingale Orchestrator, which really focuses on automated response for not just security, but all the IT infrastructure. But one thing I want, because sometimes this comes up when I'm talking about the energy sector, people say, well, they got so many more people than we have. And I can tell you that's not true. I thought that was the case. And what I've been finding is, and I'm talking, we're working with some very large power organizations, probably much larger than most hospitals. And unfortunately, their IT security teams are maybe 7, 8, 9 people. So I know some of you have maybe one person doing it, but if you think about the size of your organization versus a power company that's providing energy for an entire state, let's just say maybe like the state of Montana or North Carolina or New York State, not that we've worked with them, but let's just say, and you suddenly realize, hey, they only got like on average 9 people, including their CISO, to manage all of that infrastructure, including nuclear power plants. It starts to really open your eyes to, these aren't organizations that have hundreds of people in their security teams. So again, they're resource constrained and economically challenged. One thing they've really adopted, if you look at the bottom of the slide, is things like tactical and strategic analysis. And if you think about any of you that work with us on the security side, you will hear us say things like tactical forensics, or attack alert, right? Or things like our security operations center is a CTOC, a cybersecurity tactical operations center. The energy sector has embraced this concept of being tactical in security very, very well. I think healthcare, again, is still kind of a few years back on that, and we try very hard as CloudWave to really introduce this concept of being tactically minded in security, including tactical incident response and a bunch of other things that we work on. So that's kind of their risk-based approach, and I think there's a lot just there to unpack and learn from. And again, I understand you can't do it all, but I think it's important to understand, where this could go. So let's talk about the technologies they're relying on. And I think one of the interesting parts is they're kind of phasing and moving away from SIEMs. Some of you may have SIEMs or rely on SIEMs, or rely on Splunk and things like that. And for most part, energy sector is kind of, leaving that technology behind. I'm not saying they don't use it. Most of it is because they've owned it for decades and it's there, just similar to, any of you that have legacy systems. But we're seeing that they've kind of turned the corner, and they're really looking at things like deep packet inspection, and they're doing things like attack surface management. They're doing intrusion detection and prevention, or network intrusion detection and prevention. They are using host intrusion detection. They are using honeypots. So that, kind of is for them just a matter of the foundation of their security programs, right? Those are not optional. And they're really trying to focus now on the next evolution, which is probably going to be around AI-based security detection and monitoring. Just to talk a little bit about attack surface management. Attack surface management, just so you guys, I don't know who knows what this is, it's sometimes a confusing term. Your attack surface is anything public facing, right? So anything that communicates outside of your hospital or from the outside of the hospital in. So when we say attack surface, we don't really include all your internal network devices. We're really talking about what's exposed to the outside world, and how do we get, focused on shutting down and controlling and managing those points of entry and exit. And that's a really big deal for for energy sector. And I think that's a really good lesson for healthcare. If you do have limited economics and you can't do, full-blown monitoring or lock everything down, then really spin up a project to focus on how do you manage and control your attack surface. And the thinking from the energy sector here is that if you can, really harden your attack surface, your external facing environment, then you have really drastically reduced your risk of somebody doing something in the environment. That doesn't mean they don't monitor the internal networks and environment, but they really are trying to figure out how do we stop people from ever getting in, and how do we detect that something's already in here and communicating outward to something it shouldn't be. So if you're interested in doing that kind of stuff, let us know. We're spinning up hopefully a new attack surface management program, which we've learned a lot from the energy sector on that regard. What I will say about this advanced monitoring stuff and everything they're doing, we often, for any of you that are clients of ours, using our CAS solution, this is everything in CAS, right? CAS has deep packet and real-time inspection. It is using, NIDS and NIPS and intrusion detection and host intrusion detection and honeypots. So this is very familiar to you. And one thing I will say about this, we didn't learn this from the energy sector. We actually created our offering before we ever got involved with the energy sector. So it was actually a great kind of sanity check, if you will, to realize, hey, the energy sector, this is where they're going or have been, and kind of how they're evolving. And we've been offering that in CAS since 2016. The other area that we see is red teaming, right? And this is something, again, I don't see a lot of in the healthcare sector. And I would probably argue that most hospitals shouldn't invest in red teaming. I think it's a cool concept, and every once in a while somebody will come to me and say, hey, we want to run a red team exercise. And the reason I say you shouldn't invest in it in most cases is if you haven't done the basics. Like, my advice to you would be, if I had, if I could spend your money for you, I would say go do some of the other stuff, right? Like, before you go do red teaming, get your dynamic risk assessment program in place, get threat intelligence monitoring in place, get this advanced monitoring in place, get those things done, go do attack surface management. And then when you have all those things, then go do red teaming, right? Red teaming is really cool, and you'll talk to pen testers, and you'll talk to some of our pen testers, and they'll try and push you on a red team exercise. If you've done all that and you want to go do a red team, that's great. If you haven't done all that and you get a really good red team and they really know what they're doing, you're just going to end up with a list of stuff that it's not going to go well, right? And why bother doing that? Like, if you already know that you're not going to probably do well, why spend the money on it? Go put the money into other things that can help shut down risk, and then eventually go do that red team. Let's talk about culture, because this is a big part of how they've kind of been able to evolve and mature. And look, I will say, first of all, that, hey, the regulations help in this regard, right? Because you're not fighting the C-suite or whoever it may be that security is important and you got to invest in security. And if you're fighting that fight, it's hard to have a security culture. But they are very security minded. They do not shy away from the concept that their organizations are attacked every day. They are being attacked by nation states. They are being attacked by cyber criminals. They are being attacked by cyber terrorists. But guess what? So are you. You guys are all being attacked by those groups, and I would bet a root beer float that if we look at your firewall logs, you will see IP attempts from Iran or China or Taiwan or Malaysia or Pakistan, who probably have no patients in your hospital, right? And so those are nation state probably, or cyber terrorism. And we probably see things occurring from Eastern Bloc and cyber criminals. So you're defending against the same people they are. But they acknowledge it and they take that mission that this is happening every day, and our job is to reduce our attack surface and figure out how to keep them out. They probably do have stronger cross-department collaboration, though I will say in the healthcare sector, we've been seeing a lot more cross-department collaboration. I think recently we've been doing a lot of pen tests for organizations where we're not doing not pen testing, we're doing tabletops for organizations and not really focusing on IT and how IT responds to a cybersecurity incident. We've been focusing a lot more on how does everybody else in the hospital respond to a cybersecurity incident. And I think that's helped a lot to create cross-departmental collaboration and realize an IT event, security event, is not just an IT problem. There's a lot more to it. But so I think this is an area we actually probably match or starting to match the ability that the energy sector has. Accountability and ownership, again, I think as we see more tabletops being used to educate non-IT people on their roles in a security event, we're seeing more accountability. Transparency is a big one. This comes back to, things like, the sharing of information. And I think within hospitals, I still see there's a lot of reluctance to share kind of security information. And if you are doing that and you do have transparency, you get really ahead of the pack. Continuous training, this is a big one, and we do see this as a challenge in a lot of times when we're dealing with hospitals is, continuing training for the IT security team. I get everybody's doing security awareness training, but that's not what we're talking about here. Like, we have, I guess next week we're going into October Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which I'm not a big fan of, but we can debate that later. Anyway, that's all about the end user. And the one area we see kind of a gap in is ongoing training for the actual IT security team. And energy sector, that's a big difference, right? They are continually required to train people in their IT security team. So they do things, and those training doesn't have to be you send somebody to school, though that's great. It can be things like drills that they run, assuring that if there's new threat landscape that people are being trained on how to deal with that. Like, there's a vast difference right now in how phishing attacks are being done. AI has really made phishing much more effective. So, within the energy sector, I'm pretty sure that at this point in time, they're thinking about how are they going to defend against AI-based phishing attacks. I would also suspect that in the healthcare sector, most people aren't even aware of the fact that AI-based phishing attacks is happening, and what's that mean, and how do we have to change how we respond to that. And all of that is really just examples of training that should be ongoing for our IT and IT security teams. They also, because of their regulations, and I think this is something that is important to understand even within healthcare, we do have, from a civil liability perspective, a question that will come up if you ever face a civil liability suit, or even if you have to go through a HIPAA breach and audit, is, well, what is the training level? How do you check the knowledge of your team? Show us, what you've done to assure they really know their jobs. The energy sector, that is something they have to do. So all IT security team members have to be able to demonstrate that they actually do understand that. And again, I've had conversations in healthcare where people will say, well, we do a yearly HIPAA training. That's not what we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about you being able to specifically demonstrate you have strong knowledge of your firewall and how to configure it and blah, 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 blah. And they do bring in, obviously, a lot of external people to help create workshops and training opportunities. Good news is all of this stuff in the CIP, it's a Cybersecurity Insider program that we do, qualifies for that ongoing training. But if you think of the entire healthcare sector, and think about how much of this type of stuff is going on, I don't think that it's a lot, right? And so I think there is a hunger for knowledge, but unfortunately, it's not something that culturally we're doing a great job of. And hopefully this CIP is helpful for you in that regard. So when we talk about security integration, right, there's a big piece that they focus on. And I think this is something that does have to turn the tide in the healthcare sector. And we've kind of not learned our lesson, right? If you think about EMRs and the world prior to the single EMR platform, we had all these best of breed products out there, right? We had an ED system, we had an OR system, we had a pharmacy system, we had an order entry system. And, we then decided, as an industry, like, hey, it's probably better to have one single platform. The energy sector has really worked on that. And so they do have, kind of this common operating picture. I'll get back to incident response in a moment, where it is a single pane of glass. And they have the ability to see things in real time across multiple systems. They have either deployed or contracted for a security operations center. They can't just say, oh, well, we didn't see that alert because we weren't monitoring anything at 3 in the morning. And then, obviously they have detection tools, which we've talked about. So this concept of a common operating picture, this single pane of glass, is a big deal in the energy sector. And so within healthcare, we see people either cobbling together things through Splunk or other stuff, or they just have multiple systems, and they don't really have a single pane of glass, and they're not really architecting their security infrastructure in a way to afford a common operating picture. And that becomes overwhelming. And the reason I brought up that EMR example is that's kind of what happened, right? Like, physicians needed to have a common operating picture of a patient. And it's hard to do when you have a patient that's treated on one system in the ED and then another system in the OR. And then when they're discharged or released to the floor, it's yet another system. And then trying to wire all that up with HL7 gets even harder to do, and then DICOM and ADT. And we kind of learned, like, hey, let's minimize our pain points. Not that they don't exist, and we're still not trying to do things with fire and other stuff, but having that common operating picture certainly does make life easier. Now back to incident response. They spend a lot of time on incident response, and they do some of the things that I think are done in healthcare, like scenario drills, like tabletops that I mentioned, things like that. But I think the two things they do that are really important and critical, one is surprise drills. And I think this is pretty fascinating, and I think important to do. And I think this is the evolution of tabletops. Like, when we first started doing tabletops back in 2013, we started with tabletops focused on just the IT staff. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, now we're starting to do a lot more tabletops. In fact, in the past year, I don't think we've done one IT-focused tabletop. We've done a bunch of them, and all of them are focused on the non-IT parts of the hospital. The C-suite, the clinical teams, operations, all of that. And I think the next evolution of this will be surprise drills, right? Where we have clients who will come to us and say, hey, we want to contract you to do tabletops, but we don't want you to tell us when the tabletop's going to occur. And we don't want to know anything about it, right? We just want to be surprised, and we want to see how we're going to react. And I think that's kind of the next level, and the energy sector is already doing that. And I can always, I can feel through my Jedi powers that people on this call are probably like, oh my God, that would never work here. We couldn't get everybody on the call, and people would be upset if we called them at 3 in the morning to do a tabletop. And, I get that. So you have rules of engagement to kind of make it a little more palatable. But the idea is you're not going to really know how good you'll do until you do get surprised. And we kind of are, already used to this at some level in healthcare, right? Because all I got to mention is two organizations that surprise you guys all the time. One is JCO, and the other is CMS, right? And when they show up, everybody drops what they're doing and goes to deal with this. And it's a great way to figure out where the hospital stands. So I think surprise drills for IR, incident response, will be something that we see over the next 1 to 3 years kind of start to take shape in the healthcare sector, knowing that, hey, the energy sector is already doing that. This time response, I think, is another thing, is they really do focus on how long it takes them to stand up incident command, how long does it take them to get things under containment or prevention. So they really do measure themselves and then use that as a way to learn and continually improve, which I think, to do that, you have to at some point get a little better at surprise drills and things like that. So I want to talk about how they kind of do some of this, right? Especially the risk-based management. And for some of you, you've already done this with us. For some of you, you may not know about this, so I'm going to share it with you. I'll start by saying we do this. We've adopted this framework, the C2M2 framework, to healthcare. And we find that clients that use it, actually their maturity goes up, and their ability to manage their security program is much, much more robust than people trying to do NIST CSF, or just HIPAA or high tech or high trust rather, or whatever you may be doing. So what happened is back in 2012 is the energy sector realized, hey, we're in a shambles, and we need to figure out where all of our power, our constituents within the sector stand from a maturity perspective. And so they created this thing called C2M2, which stands for Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, right? It's two C's, two M's. And they made that available to all energy organizations throughout the country. And it's a very rapid way to figure out where you stand from a security perspective. So what happens is basically C2M2 is going to look at 10 different areas, 10 domains, and it's going to rate your level of maturity in each one of those domains. And this is a very powerful tool. So you typically, when we work with clients, they go through it the first time, and it does qualify as, it actually exceeds the standards of a HIPAA assessment. But in any case, you go through it kind of the first time, and then what most of our clients do is once they go through it, we have some tools that they use to do it on their own on a quarterly basis, so they can keep kind of start adopting that dynamic risk approach that I mentioned earlier. But you're going to be evaluated across those 10 areas, and this is what the energy sector, the power suppliers do, and that translates, and for each domain, they're going to look at, are you not doing this? Are you kind of sort of doing this practice? Are you doing this practice and it's documented? And are you managing this practice appropriately? And all of this kind of these domains and these maturity levels translate into a dashboard. And I won't go too deep into this dashboard, but basically if you look at the bottom, you can see RM, ACM, IAM. What those are is the actual domain. So RM is risk management. If you look all the way over to the right, you can see ISC, and that's information sharing, right? So you could see that in the energy sector, they designed this to require people to share information. You're being tested on how well do you share that information. You can see next to it IR, incident response. How well are you doing incident response and how well are you suited for it? And MIL 1, 2, and 3 are your levels of maturity. So I won't go too much deeper into it, but I will say basically this is used from boardroom to basement, right? Because everybody can look at this and know that where there's red, there's work to be done. Where there's green, you're doing well. And everybody's aware this is going to change based on the current threat landscape, right? If I suddenly release some threat intelligence that, hey, AI is really, we've got this massive AI hive polymorphic attack occurring, well, then your incident response capabilities would turn red because you probably don't have a plan to address, polymorphic hive AI attacks. But now you address it and it goes to green. So this is a dynamic living dashboard that kind of ebbs and flows. But on a quarterly basis, or every 6 months at the least, there's a kind of conversation at the C-suite board level so that everybody understands where this is. And the bigger power around this that we see is you can have business conversation, right? You can make decisions around, hey, we have a lot of red in the EDM column, which is basically supply chain. So are we going to invest to deal with that? No, we're not. We're going to accept that risk. Well, great. Now everybody in the organization knows we've got that risk. We're not going to invest in it because we can't, but we all are going to accept it. Or if you're going to invest, then you can have quite the conversations around how much is that investment going to cost and what's going to happen, to over what period of time and things like that. So, the one thing we see is that this becomes kind of the foundation to where the energy sector operates. Are they doing NIST 853, NIST CSF? Yes, they are. But all of that is kind of secondary to this foundation, which I think is really important because it's a very dynamic, fluid way to kind of operate the security program. From our perspective, when we do this for people, we do have a ton of collateral that comes with it, but most people really focus on that dashboard. So, if you're interested in something like that, happy to talk to you guys more about it, but that's kind of the secret sauce behind the energy sector. The other thing I'll talk about is just as a plug here is our CAS product. If you haven't really become familiar with CAS from us, which is a cybersecurity as a service, I invite you to reach out to us. Pretty much everything we talked about that the energy sector is doing is baked into CAS. And so we're pretty proud of that because, again, we didn't do this based on the energy sector. We just came to learn that, wow, everything we thought was the right thing to do I think is kind of the right thing to do. Doesn't mean we can't improve and we got things to fix, but ultimately I think we got a pretty good foundation from a security perspective. So the last thing before we wrap up, there's a survey that's going to be thrown into your chat window. We're really trying to figure out how to make this a valuable program for you guys in 2024. So please, you know, if you can take a few minutes to just fill out that survey, tell us what you like, what you hate, what you love, what you think we should be doing, how this could be more valuable. And we definitely will take that very seriously and analyze that and incorporate as much as we can into 2024. So with that, not sure if there are any questions or not, but that was kind of everything I had. I hope this is somewhat eye-opening, gives you some food for thought. You know, I realize people can't do everything, but maybe you walk away with one thing you can try to do. You know, if you can't do anything else, I suggest doing C2M2. It's a very powerful tool for figuring out how to get everybody in the organization rallied around where do you stand and where do you need to go. With that, I don't know, Laura, if there's any questions or anything else that we need to go through or thoughts.
We did have a couple questions.
Sure.
The first is, what ratio of employees do cybersecurity full-time employees do you typically see?
In the energy sector, I'm assuming?
Possibly, yes.
Yeah, so I'll assume it's in the energy sector. So like I said, most organizations we've worked with, and they're pretty large. I can't disclose their names because of our contractual requirements, but they are really big. They're not really small. Let me just say this, it's not Rhode Island. You know, so I can tell you most of them are employing somewhere in the neighborhood of between 10 and 20,000 employees. And think about the energy sector. I should mention this, right? It's not just like one facility. They're dealing with the security of not only every office, but also every vehicle, right? Because every vehicle they have has MDTs. So think about how many thousands of power vehicle trucks and you know, equipment they have, and then on top of that is all of the substations that they're dealing with, right? So when we think about the amount of employees that they have, you know, it's really big, right? I'm probably underestimating their numbers, right? So let's just take like a state like Florida, right? And how big Florida is, and if you think about how much, you know, needs to be done to provide power across the state, the substations, the bill payment offices, then you add in the nuclear power plants and all the safeguards they have to do there. You know, I'll give you an example of when we first got into working with them. And again, we don't do this a lot, but we could call it every once in a while. And I think it's because we offer a different perspective than the organizations that are completely focused on energy. You know, one of the things that was eye-opening to me is it's not just all that infrastructure they have. A lot of these organizations have their own police departments, right? They're actually incorporated as you know, there's a special government classification for them, and they actually have their own police force. And then on top of that, a lot of them have their own in-house clinicals teams, right? They have actual clinics that are part of their infrastructure, so they're dealing with HIPAA. So then you think about all that infrastructure across an entire state, and you're talking about an organization that has an IT security team of maybe 10 people. And that to me is really eye-opening. And some of the other things we've seen them do is, like, some of them are trying to create their own pen test labs, you know, and doing kind of some other things that are kind of creative that I didn't put into the slide deck. But hopefully that helps you in terms of thinking through ratios. And a lot of it is because they are using automation, they are using things like C2M2, you know, they are investing in their people and trying to continually make them better and more productive. Automation, again, is a big thing. They're using advanced detection tools like network intrusion detection, and, you know, they're not sitting there doing log analysis every day. You know, they have SOCs. They're contracting a SOC or using a SOC. But hopefully that helps you on the ratios. But if I got it wrong, please let me know. What else, Laura?
The next one is more of a comment, but maybe you can give your thoughts. It says the energy sector is ahead because they have more financial resources than other industries, especially healthcare, where margins are extremely slim for institutions.
So maybe you might have missed the beginning. So actually their margins are lower than hospitals, right? So I think hospitals are, and I could be wrong in this, are in the 3 to 6 range of margins, and most of the at least the ones we work with, are about 1 to 3% margins. So they're not very profitable. In fact, many of them, in fact, I know of one, I can't really give these details, but that actually filed bankruptcy, and is actually federally subsidized. So their margins are basically zero, and everything they do has to be approved by a federal congressional oversight. So it is a really very challenging. And I agree. When I first one I ever did, I'm like, oh, you guys must be, you're getting money from everybody, right? So you must be cash cow, right? And then I realized, whoa, you're probably even worse than healthcare in terms of your margins. Next.
There are no more questions.
All right. Well, hopefully this was helpful. Happy to talk to people. Otherwise, again, please let us know in the survey what else we can do if you're more interested in things like this, or more specific to, security practices or whatever it is. We are trying to see if we can get FDA to join us on one of these conversations and have them present or talk or share or do a panel. So we'll see how that goes. Probably will happen, if it does happen, in the Q1 timeframe. But with that, thank you so much for today, and truly hope this was helpful to you guys. Thanks.